It's an honor to be here today to speak to all of you. Been part of the church as Phyllis, as James has said from the very beginning, and it's been exciting to see everybody and be part of this family. I think it was last November when Kenneth Wang shared from a favorite passage of mine from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 19. It's, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And Kenneth used that passage to share different stories from his own life that were struggles that he went through, but then looking back, how he could also see the grace of God in each of those times. And I'm going to be doing something kind of similar today. When you're my age, you have a lot of experiences that you can choose and pick from and share from, so that's one advantage of being a little older. And I'm also going to share from a passage in 2 Corinthians. The verse is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. And I'll just read it out here so I don't make a mistake. "But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us." But we're going to read a little longer passage, verse before, and a couple of verses afterwards, just to give some context to this verse. So if we can read it together, we'll try that. "Who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-suppressing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Okay, so that's the passage that I want to speak on, and we're going to look at verse 6 briefly, and then I'm going to finish with verse 6 at the end. So I just wanted to read this, but this is the treasure that is within the jar of clay. "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ." So this is just Paul in a kind of poetic way talking about the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And I wanted just to read it once in its entirety, just to see, it reminds me of kind of a Celtic blessing in a way, but we're going to dissect it a little bit more at the end, but sometimes when you dissect it, you might lose some of the beauty. So just remember, this is what the treasure is that is within the jar of clay. Okay. When Paul talks about the clay jar, the clay pot, that he's talking about his own life and the life of those that are with him in the service of the gospel. And I just want to share, when I was served in Uzbekistan for 10 years in Central Asia. Most of that time I lived in the city of Samarkand. Some of you may have heard of that city. It's part of the Silk Road. But right beside the city where I was living was the place called Afrasiab, which is the ancient city that was there originally. People lived there from 500 BC to about 1,200 years AD. So it hasn't been lived in for a very long time. And they've done some scientific excavations there and dug up, you could see some walls that they found, some outlines of buildings. They found some frescoes which are now in a museum. But when I lived there, it was just a bunch of hills, nothing was going on, and anybody could go over there and walk, over these hills and see these pieces of history. And it was an interesting thing to do. And one of the things you'd notice if you go over there is that everywhere you saw these bits of pottery on the ground. It's not the fine ceramics, the painted, ornate type of pottery. It was just bits of clay pots, color of earth. They were brittle, you could easily break them. And this is the clay pots that Paul is talking about. They were everywhere. Obviously, when people dropped them or they broke, they just left them there. And so there's kind of like today our, plastic disposable soda cups. That was probably how people treated them then, except they're just a little bit more environmentally friendly. But so when Paul talks about these clay pots, he's talking about his own life, how he sees himself as brittle, ordinary, and easily broken. We can see that when we read, if we go to verses 8 and 9. And I want to take a liberty and just adding a couple of verses. A couple of words, in between. Each thing is kind of like a couplet. And I'm going to just say thanks to Jesus in the middle, because this is what Paul is saying, that because of the treasure within, these hardships he could endure. But without that treasure within, these hardships could have crushed him, could have ended up in despair. So if we read, we are hard pressed on every side. Thanks to Jesus, not crushed. Perplexed, but thanks to Jesus, not in despair. Persecuted, but thanks to Jesus, not abandoned. Struck down, but thanks to Jesus, not destroyed. And that's, what Paul is saying in that verse. So what's clear from this passage is that that Paul suffered, that Paul had hardships, that Paul faced real danger, and any of those things could have led to him feeling despair, feeling defeated, and even destroyed. Knowing Jesus did not protect him from any of these things. In fact, sometimes it was because of his faith that he was suffering. But what it did, it gave him hope, it helped him to endure, and ultimately to overcome. A few weeks ago, James organized for a panel to be up here to share and answer some questions about their faith. And then we broke up into small groups to also share our story, a story of how God has worked in our life. And I shared a story that I was kind of taken by surprise, because I felt emotions came to the surface that I hadn't felt for a while. But so we'll see how we do today. But I was going back to when I was 18 years old. I had just given my life to following Jesus, but I hadn't told anybody at all that I'd taken this step. I was part of a youth fellowship, and in that youth fellowship I heard how a friend had his father was in hospital, and he had taken the opportunity to pray with his dad. He prayed the Lord's Prayer, and then he asked, for God to heal his father. And he said, doing that simple act, he had never done anything like that before, but it really touched his father. His father appreciated it, and it changed their relationship. And it just, let his father know that his son now followed Jesus. And so I thought, wow, that's a cool story, but, my father's not in hospital. But I was looking for a way that I could introduce, let my parents know, let people know that I was now a follower of Jesus. Well, 3 weeks later, my father had a heart attack. We called the ambulance, and he was admitted to the local hospital. And, I felt in my heart, I have to pray with my dad now, because, that meant the story was fresh in my mind, and I felt that this was something God was wanting me to do. And not just pray for my father, but to pray with him. And so the first night we went in, the whole family, my mom, my brother, my sister, and myself, and we, spent time with Dad. And he was doing good for somebody who'd had a heart attack. He was, chatting away. And when it came to leave, I went and left with my family and felt, why did I chicken out? Why didn't I stop and pray? And, the weird thing was I was anxious because my dad was getting better and he'd be out of hospital soon. And so, that's kind of weird, but that was what was in my heart. I wanted to not miss this moment to pray with my dad. And so the next night, when we went in, my mom and brother and sister got up to leave, and I said, I'll catch up with you later. I'm going to stay a little longer with my dad. And, that was fine. And then I asked Dad if I could pray with him, and he said, for sure. And so I prayed the Lord's Prayer with him, and I asked for God's healing for my father. I asked that he'd be able to give up smoking, which is something he'd done since the age of 13. And so it was a pretty deep-rooted addiction. And I asked that he'd be able to go back to work. And it was simple. But and then I left, and I felt relieved. I felt I'd done it. And it did touch my father. And how I know that was because he was telling everybody the next day that I was praying for him. And when you're a shy kid like me, that was the exact opposite of what I wanted him to be doing. But he was. And, I guess, it was good. The word was going out that I was praying for him. And then that night, we got a call from the hospital. And it was my father had a stroke. And when we went in to see him, he was paralyzed on his left side. And he was so weak, he could barely talk. And we learned that he did have to do the defibrillation, the paddles and all of that. And so that was a shock. But what he was saying over and over again was that he couldn't die because David was praying for him. And see, it's happening again. When I heard that, I felt so small and just felt, what might have happened if a chicken died and walked out the second night too. It felt that the prayer, hadn't protected him from the stroke, but it had given him this sort of will to live and to fight through it. And he did give up smoking only because he was disabled and he couldn't go and get the cigarettes for himself, because it was weeks of struggle until he finally was able to really quit. And there's lots of stories about what he tried to do to get cigarettes over those weeks. But we held out, he got through. He did recover, but it was after months of physical therapy that I was able to help him with. And he did end up going back to work. And so all the prayers were answered, not the way we expected. But for me, it was a deep, deep message from God. When God places a burden on your heart, tells you this is what I want you to do, then you need to do that. So Let me move on. I don't want to miss any stories. The following year, I went to veterinary college. I went to London, and even though I was only a believer for about a year, I already had this desire in my heart to combine my faith and my profession in some way, in some sort of developing context. I was expecting, to go work overseas. Yeah, and so that was my goal or desire. I felt that was God's will for my life. It made sense to me that I could use these skills in some way to help animals and people. When I started vet school, I was very active, involved in the Christian group, the student groups, active in church. And it was interesting, God can speak to you in different ways. But towards the end of my time in college, we were playing a board game with other people in the Christian group, and the question came up, who in the room you think is most like a high court judge? And the two girls picked me, and the reason was that I always made them feel guilty. And when I heard that, I thought, that's not what I want to do. Yeah. And so I realized, sometimes me trying to encourage them was really me pressuring them to attend, to go to church, to do different stuff. And so that really spoke to me. And so I learned to relax a little bit, to give people more space and to leave it to God to do some of this, not do it myself. So that was not really a hardship, but it was a way God spoke to me, and it made a difference. I participated in a number of short-term missions, both as student and later as a working veterinarian, and that just helped me keep that vision alive that I had, that I would use my faith and my profession together. It was within a couple of months of me graduating from vet school, before I'd started my first job. We were at a wedding for a cousin of mine, and my father had a second heart attack. And this time he passed away, on the way to the hospital. And that was a shock to us all, but I had a tremendous sense of peace as well, that this was, God's timing. I felt His presence at that time. And I remember reading scripture that morning before, this happened, from John's Gospel about Jesus being the vine and we are the branches. And I just felt that kind of close intimacy with Jesus. And I was able to share some of those things with the people at the funeral. And I was able to do that. I felt I could. And so that was something that I really appreciated, the 5 years that we'd had with my father, that, might not have had otherwise. And it was a very important 5 years. We had a deeper relationship in those 5 years than the 18 years before. I had a plan to work in England. This is where, I trained in England, although, I'm from Ireland. And I had a plan to go back, get a job in England. But I also had an opportunity to stay in Ireland, stay with my mom and work there. But I chose to follow my original plan. And my mom blessed it, and she didn't want to be a burden to anybody. But what we didn't know was 6 months later she'd be diagnosed with cancer. And she was about a month in hospital, and then she passed away. And this time, I didn't have peace about it. I did have regrets. I regretted that I didn't do more for my mom, when I could have. And that was tough for me. But even in that time, it was my faith and just knowing Jesus helped me through. I think I didn't fully mourn for my parents because I was working in England. I was used to not seeing them around. It wasn't strange for them not to be there. It didn't really seem real that, they'd passed. But what did hit me was I had entered into a relationship with a girl. I even got engaged, and then that relationship broke up. And when that happened, it all kind of came flooding back. Not only was the relationship over, but my parents were gone, and I felt alone. And I remember asking myself, why am I working so hard? For whom? I'm killing myself with all this work, and there's nobody there. And I remember even one of my friends, was worried about me, thought, I might hurt myself. And so that was a really low point in my life. But it was also a time when I think God and Jesus became even more real and more depth that I hadn't got before. And for sure, I learned something about compassion, and I learned, I felt more, I could identify more with other people that were struggling. And I knew for myself there was no easy answers. There's no pat answer that was going to make a difference. And so I stopped giving pat answers to other people. So I could see how God, used that experience to shape me and to, make me who I am. It was about 7 years after graduation that I finally, answered, if you like, that call, or things came together for me to work overseas long term. Went to Uzbekistan, which is in Central Asia, which, is, if you don't know, is got borders with all the other stands. A little border with Afghanistan, but it was part of the former Soviet Union. And I went there. I went there alone, but there I found family in the team we were with. It really felt like we're part of an extended family. And then, I went single. When I left, I had a wife, Janet, and 2 kids, Andrew and Anna. So I went, if you went empty, came back full. And there's lots of stories, we can share. Over those 10 years, we saw God's grace again and again and again. It was a special time. I had a lot of close friends. I learned the language. I lived with a local family for 5 years, and so they became part of their family as well. And so, I felt so blessed, and God worked in so many ways in my life at that time, and filled in some of the emptiness that I had. But yeah, it came one day. I was invited into the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So this is their police, their secret police. And at that time, we were invited to leave, and we were given 72 hours to do that. And so that was a shock, it was a whirlwind. We had to say goodbye to all the friends and our home and everything that we had made there. It's deportation, not quite the same as being deported from here. We had to leave Uzbekistan and return to the U.S., which is not a horrible option, but it was quite the shock. arrived here, Janet's family and our friends in our church, everything made the landing a soft landing for us. And God worked in amazing ways at that time too. I came as a tourist because you had 3 days to come, but the immigration process was really smooth for me. I was able to get a job. I'm a veterinarian in the UK, but I did not have a license to work in the US. But I was able to get a part-time job at the university. And, if sometimes universities can have a kind of umbrella where they'll have people from all over the world can work there under their covered. And so I was able to work even though I didn't have the license. The license took, 2 years of study and exams and tests and quite the process to get that. But, so I saw God, work in ways, and even in my own heart, it was, our hand was forced that we had to leave, but it was probably the right time for us to go. And we still have good relationships with many people back in Uzbekistan. I still see them sometimes on Zoom or talk on the phone. But yeah, let me see where I'm at now. So, what was the best thing about coming back here? Probably it's New City Church, yeah. Because as James shared, when we came back, we had a church, Janet's home church or ascending church. It's called Young Knock English Ministry. And so although it's English ministry, it's Korean English ministry. It was a Korean church, but mostly young people, professionals. And I was very happy to be there, but I wasn't really, identifying with the people there. But Pastor Kevin had already made the transition from being a lawyer to a pastor, and he was a pastor in that church. And he was involved in Love LA, a ministry here in Skid Row. And it was that summer that after we came back in February. With Andrew was just 2 years old, Anna was 5 months old, and in the summer, Pastor Kevin approached us and said how we'd like to join him in this adventure of trying to plant a church in downtown LA. He wanted it to be multi-ethnic, multi-socioeconomic, and if it's going to be multi-ethnic, he couldn't have just Koreans on the team. And so he was asking if we would join him, so, we did. And for me, it was exciting to be part of this new thing. And the team that we got together was exciting to be part of that. And, we started off just meeting during the week. And then we first started meeting on Sunday in a restaurant by the Walt Disney Opera Hall. Is that what it's called? Small. And then we moved to a second restaurant in East 3rd Street. And then from there, we actually looked at this place and they said no. And we ended up at a nightclub on 7th Street, which was weird and awesome. But the strange thing, it looked kind of like a Shakespearean theater, but on 3 walls it had a bar, with all the drinks and everything. So that always, and downstairs where the kids met, there was poles. And so that was kind of strange, but definitely didn't fit the, we kind of liked it. This is definitely not a church. And so we, I felt there shouldn't be any barriers to If going to a church is a barrier, this should not be it. But then this place, somebody told us, I forget who now, that they, ask them again. They might be open now, and Kevin did, and here we are at this location. So to see all of that and to see all the different things that went on, was amazing. But we were here probably a year and a half when we had our third child, James. He was born with Down syndrome and a heart defect, and so that was a time when we really appreciated the community here and the family. People were praying with us and for us, and we felt the love that people had for us. And we have a picture. So this is when we brought James for his first time in church, being dedicated. This is 15 years ago, so we all look a little younger. But that was a special thing to be able to introduce our son. His heart defect meant that he had to have surgery, and he'd already had this surgery at this point, but complications developed, and he ended up being in the ICU. And it was there about 2 weeks when he passed away. And so, it was tough. And having the family here was really, what made it bearable, and just knowing we had prayers. And I remember at that time that I really didn't get much from teaching and sermons, but the worship and the songs and the prayers, is what was healing for my heart, and what I really appreciated and what made a difference. So, having that time, again, it just teaches you, what, you go through, but you can get out the other side with the grace of God. So one more story, very recent, less deep, if you like, or not as painful, obviously. But last November, our dog we put to sleep, and not this dog, and where I work is by an animal shelter, and so we have animals coming in a lot. And this puppy, somebody was surrendering this puppy to the shelter. It was only a week after, so too soon, but we had the opportunity, take it home and it's yours. And so we brought it home, named Siobhan. And I knew a new puppy is a lot of work, but I didn't realize just how much work this puppy would be. And, smart, too smart, and very destructive if given the opportunity. But, smart, could teach it all kinds of tricks, but we could not get it house trained. And so that was a problem. And I remember it got kind of loose stool or diarrhea, and getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, when I could hear it needed to go, but being too late each time. And after 2 nights of this, I was defeated. I felt it. And I also felt, wow, I'm a veterinarian and I can't look after this puppy. And it really felt, obviously I was also exhausted, but that was tough. That same day, when I went to work, I saw a podcast that was of a veterinarian surrendering their animal back to the rescue and talking about how it felt and how how they felt like a failure. And so even just hearing that, it's, okay, I'm not alone. This is tough. That was the low point, because after that we started to feed her less because we're overfeeding her, and that was part of the problem. We started taking her to puppy daycare. So coming home from that, she was much tireder, had a lot less energy, and would sleep more and destroy things less. And now, we have I'm excited to see her, excited that we have her. And, she is part of God's creation and God's gift to us. And, thank God for that. But yeah, she is still a handful. So we are all jars of clay, brittle and easily broken by all that life throws at us. But what makes us truly special is the treasure, that is within us. And if we read verse 6 again, for God who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. So what does it mean? Here Paul references, God's act of creation, that God spoke light into existence. In the previous chapter, chapter 3, Paul brings up from Exodus chapter 34, the story of Moses receiving the Ten Commandments. And when he returned from the mountain, his face was glowing light, and so much so that the people asked him to put a veil on his face, because that time with God had left him radiant. And Paul talks about that, saying, the radiance of the old covenant is nothing compared to the radiance of the new. There were false teachers at that time that were encouraging the members of the church in Corinth to not listen to Paul, but to follow the old covenant and the new together. So follow all the laws of Moses plus Jesus. And Paul was saying, no, the old is done with. The old was, if you like, the foundation or the looking forward, but now the new covenant has come. The light of the new, causes the old to fade and the old to disappear. And so there's a conflict going on in Corinth at that time between these different teachings. But so this is also in the mind of Paul, this radiance from God, but that, it's not from Moses' face, it's from the face of Jesus. And then thirdly, if you think about Paul's own conversion story, read in Acts 9. He was Saul at that time. He was going from Jerusalem to Damascus. He wanted to persecute the church, not only in Jerusalem, but now in Damascus. And on the road, he was surrounded by a bright light. He heard a voice. He fell down to the ground. And when he got up, he was physically blind, but spiritually transformed. And so if you think about that experience too, it's obviously always going to be in his recollection. And as we try and understand this verse, what it means. For me, that light shines into our heart. Knowledge of God's glory, knowledge of God's light, knowledge and truth about Jesus is what transforms us. But not just knowledge and truth, but also experience of Jesus in our lives. Each of those times, Paul experienced Jesus, encountered Jesus, Moses encountered God, that we too need to encounter Jesus for ourselves and have it touch our hearts in a way that changes us, transforms us, and it needs to be on a daily basis. It needs to be ongoing, again and again, touching us, changing us, making us more what God wants us to be. We're almost there. So when we think about ourselves, maybe we think about ourselves as being something ordinary, something not special, kind of like a disposable plastic soda cup that could be tossed, of no value. But when we think about what's inside of us, it's knowledge of the glory of God shining in the face of Jesus, that power within us, that is what makes us special. That's what makes us priceless. That's what makes us worthy. And that's how we should see ourselves, and that's how we should see other people. And that will transform not only ourselves, but our community. So I'm going to pray now, and then we'll be done. Okay? Dear God, help us to see you more clearly and know you more intimately so that we can live our lives more wholly committed to you. Thank you for shining into our hearts the knowledge of your glory that we can see most clearly in your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.